My name is Said Akhtar. I'm a program manager in charge of the authentication libraries at Microsoft. So MCell, ADL, ASP.NET, we'll talk about those. I'm here today to demo for you the entire developer experience for authentication. We've got some awesome things to show you. I'd like to kind of find out who's in the room. So I'd like to know how many people build like line of business apps within your company. Okay, great. And how many of you have gotten to the point where you've signed in users and then you've also accessed data securely? So a number of you. And how many of you thought that experience was super easy? Not many. In fact, I don't think I saw a single hand come up. So as the somewhat verbose title implies, we're making it easy. And we're going to dig right into this. Oh, we're going to build an app today. So I want you to think of the name of an app, and I'm going to ask you for that later. All right, let's get to the agenda. So first up, we have the Microsoft Identity Platform. So we're going to talk about our vision and what makes a world-class identity platform. We're going to talk about how we're simplifying the application registration experience. We're going to talk about the Microsoft authentication libraries. We're going to deep dive on browser-based JavaScript applications written in an MCell.js. And then we're going to talk about how you can update at your own pace. So one of the most important points that I want to make, and this is, if you take away one thing from this session, we're not pulling the rug out from under you. We're going to demo how you can update at your own pace without abandoning your existing investments in applications and services. So I'm going to kind of cut this down into 4 different things that are required for a world-class authentication system: reaching all of your users, security and trust, being ready for your business, and last, importantly, how to do fast and simple integration. So the first of these is reach your target audience. So you have all sorts of types of users that you want to be able to reach: employees, students, business partners, customers. Azure Active Directory has a really unique B2B model where users can sign in with the credentials of their organization, and still you manage the access of what resources they can get at within your tenant. So why is this such a unique model, and why is it so great? Well, one thing that's nice is that if you've invited a vendor in Contoso to access resources within your tenant, and then they leave that organization, they've immediately lost access to all of those resources, and there was no special communication between your company and Contoso. The next is B2C. We have a really unique offering at Azure AD B2C, which allows you to build very customized experiences where you can reach your customers and they can sign in with their existing social identity, or they can create a branded identity with you. So I like to think about breaking this down into 2 main categories. So the first is organizations. Within organizations, I know many of you have investments in on-prem, Active Directory on-prem. Of course, we're moving to the cloud, but we have a very unique offering in terms of hybrid capabilities. We have the ability to both synchronize and federate to your on-premise identity. And then there's individuals that you need to be able to reach. So I'm going to talk about Microsoft account, of course. But then there's existing social identities that your customers have that you need to be able to reach. Or they may want to create a new identity, username and password that's branded, hey, log in with your Contoso account. So for security and trust, there's 2 things I want to hit on. The first is advanced identity and data protection. The second one is, in order to have a really robust world-class authentication system, you need a good consent framework. So the first, we have a model for advanced identity and data protection that allows you to analyze the conditions of the authentication. We apply machine learning on the back end, which is informed by 10 terabytes of data. Running such a large-scale service at Microsoft with both consumers and enterprises at such scale gives us so much data to identify risk, so we can apply a session risk score. And then based on that session risk score, you can apply different policies. So if it's a risky sign-in, you could require MFA in that situation. And all of this benefits your app, whether you're building web apps, desktop apps. The next thing I wanted to hit on is the consent model. So there's lots of different concerns that we're trying to balance here. I'm going to start with the app developer. So the app developer cares about usage, capabilities, the fact that it's easy to integrate. Users, they just want it to be useful, usable, no worries, such that they can just start using the app and get value out of it. In IT, they care that it's safe and compliant, that they have controls, that they have auditing. And our platform provides these capabilities in a consent model that balances all these different concerns. So IT sets policies on what users can approve and not approve. IT can assert additional control in terms of, OK, what did those users approve? And did they make intelligent decisions? I can override those decisions. And usage starts happening when all of this is balanced well, making for a really productive and safe environment. So next up, ready for your business. So Microsoft's committed to open standards. This gives you the most flexibility in terms of when you're integrating APIs and services. We have a highly available, geo-redundant, multi-tenant cloud service for doing sign-ins. For sovereign environments, we have the US government, we have China and Germany. And chances are that your data is already in Graph. So I want to show you some numbers. So as you can see, I'm kind of covering both enterprise and consumer on this slide. Let's start with enterprise. 1.1 billion identities in Azure Active Directory. That's huge. It's backed by usage. So we have over 8 billion daily authentications within Azure Active Directory. Plenty of applications. It's not just enterprise. 400 million users on Outlook.com that are active users alone. And all of this results in over 90% of Fortune 500 companies having data in the graph and over 8 trillion resources in the graph. So this is your users and emails, all this data. All right, well, we made it through the marketing slides. Now it's time to get excited. This is the part that I really want to get through. We've been hard at work trying to make it such that we have a fast and simple integration. And of course, there's table stakes of good documentation and good samples. But if there's a lot of complexity there, no matter how much documentation and samples there is, it's still going to be difficult, to get done what you want to get done. So I phrased it this way: one place to get started, sample code that gives me instant gratification, for my platform and language of choice using the tools that I love. So I'm going to start talking about Microsoft's identity platform. And in the past, we've talked about these things in a disjoint way in terms of libraries, MSAL and ADAL, endpoints, V1 and V2 endpoints, portals, whether it be apps.dev.microsoft.com or the Azure portal. So your feedback was really clear. Start talking about it and start showing me the end-to-end and make the end-to-end great. So this next slide is called Cleaning Up Our Mess. And up until Friday of last week, it was called something else, but we decided to really own up to this. So let me show you what this means. Your target audience, reaching all the users that you need to reach. There's nothing wrong here. This is table stakes. We need to be able to reach on-prem, hybrid, in the cloud, MSAs, your customers. And you do that through two endpoints today, through the V1 endpoint and through the V2 endpoint. So why did we introduce the V2 endpoint? Well, be aligned to standards. We have made a commitment to open standards, and we align to industry best practices. So one of those industry best practices was to start using human-readable scopes, user.read, groups.read. Whereas in the V1 endpoint, you would ask for access to everything in a resource. So give me access to everything in SharePoint, everything in Exchange. And we've been breaking down our services in Microsoft and Microsoft Graph to make it easy to ask for the scope of data that you need and for users to be able to consent and understand, hey, I know exactly what I'm giving you access to. It's not everything. It's a particular scope. And then we had separate libraries for ADAL and MSAL. ADAL talking to the V1 endpoint, and MSAL talking to the V2 endpoint. And then the app registration experience. So in order to set up an app for ADAL, you needed to go to portal.azure.com. In order to set up an app for MSAL, you would go to apps.dev.microsoft, unless you were writing a B2C app, in which case you went to a different experience for setting up an app in portal.azure.com, but under the Azure AD B2C blade. So your feedback was really clear. This is super complex. Where do I go to set up my app? Where do I register it? Which library do I use? It depends on which service I'm talking to. There's way too much complexity here. So we need to get to one clean stack. How do we get there? Maybe we need a montage right here. I should have inserted a montage of programmers getting to the clean stack. Here it is. So there's 4 points I want to make here. We have one portal experience. So this is for managing all of your apps, no matter where they originated. In fact, we spent a significant amount of time converging and backfilling the app model such that there is no such thing as a V1 app or a V2 app anymore. We've made one application model, and we've backfilled the properties from V1 as appropriate and the properties from V2 as appropriate without interrupting any sort of live service that you have running now. That's extremely powerful. That means that there's no more managing apps here or managing apps there. There's one converged experience that I'm going to demo for you. In fact, we have people walking around building 27, building 20 apps, saying, an app is an app. And whenever a feature is introduced, we're making sure that's true. Second point, ADAL is not deprecated. In fact, we've made significant investments to make sure that your portfolio of ADAL and MSAL apps work well together. Now, the innovation is going to happen on MSAL going forward, but we're going to continue to support your apps on ADL. They're not going away. They're going to continue to work. Third point, the V2 endpoint. I don't know if you noticed here, but it used to only issue V2 tokens. Now it's capable of issuing both V1 and V2 tokens. And lastly, you'll notice ADFS is outside of that green box. Well, what does that mean? Well, Azure Active Directory does have some very great hybrid capabilities in terms of federating to ADFS, as well as synchronizing with ADFS. So you can still write an MCell app that hits the Azure AD V2 endpoint and still get access to those users. So I want to demo this new portal experience to you. We've been in private preview, and we've had a number of customers using this portal and giving us feedback, and we've been iterating on it. And so I'm really excited to be able to show this to you. All right, here it is. The first thing you'll notice is all my applications in one place. So we made it easy to find all the applications that you own, as well as just all the other applications. One of the pieces of feedback that we've had in the past is, hey, somebody else created this app, and I can't find it. Where is it? So we made it easy to go find all the applications within your tenant. I'm going to show the experience for creating a new registration. Anybody have a good name for an app? Sorry? Here we go. We're building the Ignite test app. And I want to reach both organizational users and Microsoft accounts. So I'm going to go register this app. All right, here we are at the overview. So there's lots of useful information right on this overview page in terms of my client ID, what tenant's in, and then it gives me some quick links off to do some other activities. The branding page. So based on your feedback, we've brought all of the data together for branding into one spot, so that you don't have to go hunting for different data that's exposed to the user. So in terms of logos and in terms of service, we brought it all together. Next up is authentication. So all those things that you need to do while integrating your app to get it working smoothly in terms of redirect URLs, we've brought that all together in one place. We've made some suggestions in terms of common redirect URIs that are in our samples and docs. We've made it easy to configure implicit grant. So this is used in JavaScript applications running inside a browser. This is one of the authentication flows. Before, to configure this, we actually had our docs and samples would point you to the manifest editor, and you would actually configure this in JSON. Now we've just made it easy, check boxes. Everything to do with certificates and secrets is all pulled into one location. API permissions. So your app needs to call other APIs, and you need permission to do that. A lot of your feedback has been around, well, how do I even find the API that I'm looking for? I have to look it up on docs, and it's just difficult to search for. So I want to show you what this new experience looks like. I want to add a permission. And right away, we bring all together some of the most commonly used Microsoft APIs, putting Microsoft Graph front and center. And if you're looking for a delegated permission, before all of these things were scattered, now we've made it easy to find exactly what API you're looking for. Or if you know what you're looking for, you can just type it in right here. If you're writing an API yourself and you're exposing permissions, so I said the V2 endpoint uses human-readable scopes. This is everything you need all in one place for exposing your scopes. So you can go ahead and start defining your scopes. And then you can pre-authorize specific clients. So this is so that your apps don't look silly when you're writing a Contoso app, calling a Contoso API, that your users don't see a consent screen saying, hey, can Contoso app access the Contoso API? We've made this really easy to configure. And my favorite, which I'm going to save for a little later, is the quick start experience. So all of this was based on your feedback. In fact, we actually had a lot of developers come on site and visit us in Redmond, and we gave them stickies, and we said, hey, here's all the properties. Organize them the way that makes sense to you, such that we're not creating some confusing experience. It's based on data. It's based on how people conceptualize it in their head. So when can you get this thing? We're releasing this to public preview in November. And for all of you on site here, if you go to the immersion zone, you can play around with it yourself. We've got a lab that you can try out and build a JavaScript app just like I'm going to show you here. If you want to be notified, we have a link. It's aka.ms, Identity Platform Portal. And you can provide us your email, and we'll notify you as soon as this thing goes live. So now I'm going to start talking about authentication libraries. So I've heard from all of you, why use a library? Well, I've heard from you that your goal is not to become an OAuth 2 protocol expert. Your goal is to build awesome apps, and that integration and security is often just a tax. You want to do it well, but you don't want to spend a lot of time on it. So you have choices here. Microsoft's commitment to open standards means that you can pick up lots of off-the-shelf open source libraries that are compatible with our OAuth 2 or OpenID Connect. And all of this is in service of securing access to users and data. But we want it to be simple and not spend a lot of time on it. So this is to access your own APIs as well as Microsoft's APIs, such as Microsoft Graph. So you have choices. Microsoft provides a library called MSAL. This is designed to be the best-in-class library for accessing our service. It uses the same open standards protocols. What are the advantages of using it? Well, we've made a lot of the common tasks easy to do with a few lines of code. You get the best single sign-on experiences with these libraries. And we take care of things that are somewhat complex, such as conditional access. So there are scenarios within Azure Active Directory where an IT administrator can configure sign-ins to require a managed device or managed applications, MAM, MDM. And we will just make this easy within MSAL libraries. And importantly, I'm going to keep hitting home this point that you can update at your own pace. ADL apps continue to work. A portfolio of ADL and MSAL apps will get single sign-on with one another. So when can you get these MSAL libraries? Well, all of the libraries that you see on the screen today are available in a public preview, which we provide the same production support as ADL. So if you open a support ticket and say, hey, I'm using this in production, I've got this issue, we'll support it exactly the same way as ADL. We have the same level of quality in what we've released. We go through the same QA process. You can expect that you can get these GA. We're on track to GA these in early spring. Well, if you're in the southern hemisphere, all bets are off. But northern hemisphere, early spring. Preview updates every 4 to 6 weeks. And we're bringing MCell to the same feature richness as ADL. I'm actually going to dive in, and I'm going to tell you some of the progress that we've made on these libraries. So the first thing is that you can now get a V1 token and call existing APIs. I'm going to demo that for you. You can maintain single sign-on state when you're updating from ADL to MCell. And your portfolio of apps are going to single sign-on with one another, meaning that if you have an app on mobile that you've written in Xamarin on iOS, and now you've got another mobile app, whether it's using ADL or MCell, you're going to get SSO among all of those apps with one another. Next up is MCell.js and Angular. These libraries are the furthest ahead. We consider these feature complete. We are just now integrating any feedback that you give us, and these are on track to GA soon. So we really like you to go try it for yourself, give us your feedback. We've got a link there, aka.ms/mcell survey. Give us your feedback. It'll help us get this thing to GA. Next up is .NET and UWP. So the first thing I want to call out is the .NET library works great for the scenarios that it's used in, that are available now. There are some additional flows that we're adding, but if you're writing an ASP.NET app and you're just calling resource APIs, Microsoft Graph, your own APIs, this library is ready. The things that are missing in .NET that we're adding next are there are some flows such as resource owner password credential grant. That's just a raw username and password flow that allows you to completely customize your own experience rather than show an embedded pop-up with a browser inside of it. Windows integrated authentication. This is if you have domain joined machines that are down level, such as Windows 7, and you want to be able to silently get tokens. And device code flow. So this is used in bot frameworks in situations where you don't have a keyboard. So what happens in the device code flow, authentication flow, is it shows you a URL, and then you, on a keyboard, like on your laptop or phone, you actually go to that URL, go through authentication, and then this other device is logged in. So this could be used in, on Xbox, for example, where you don't have access to a keyboard. And last, I'm going to talk about these mobile libraries. So we've made a lot of progress in embedded and default browser support. So what does that mean? Embedded browsers allow you to really control the look and feel of your application. You can render elements on top of them. So if you're migrating from ADL and you've done that within your application where you used an embedded web view and you're rendering elements on top of the embedded web view to customize the look and feel of your application, you can continue to do that. Now, the reason why we don't recommend that is that you get a lot of single sign-on benefits from using the default browser of the device. So this is Safari View Controller or Chrome Custom Tabs on Android. And what are those advantages? Imagine that you're using your iOS device, and you configured your iOS device to use Exchange. Well, just by virtue of doing that, when you configured your mailbox on the default mail client on iOS, it brings up the Safari View controller. You sign in. So you type in your credentials, UMFA, you do whatever you need to do. At the end of that flow, a cookie is written inside the Safari View controller that can be leveraged to get single sign-on on all of your applications as well. So this means that after someone's configured mail on their iOS device, they come to your application's using MCell. It's using the Safari Web View controller by default. I don't even have to sign in. All I would get is some, essentially, account selection screen, and that way I'd be able to tap my name and wouldn't have to type my credentials again. I'd be signed in. So there's some great advantages there. And then the next thing up is the Authenticator app support. So that's what we're working on, starting on now. And this gives us some more capabilities in enterprise environments. So if your application requires support for MDM or MAM, so managed devices, your IT has created a conditional access policy saying, hey, you can only access this app if the device has been registered and managed by IT. So we're going to make this simple such that your application can support the scenario without writing a bunch of extra code. You'll just basically go through the token acquisition experience, and we'll check if Authenticator app is available on the device. If it is, we'll just use the Authenticator app for sign-in. If it's not available, we'll use the default browser. So the next demo that I want to show for you is MCell.js. This is the library that's, we said is feature complete. We're ready for you to start using it. So let me explain how this flow works. So it's not an ASP.NET service accessing data in the cloud on your behalf. It is actually within your browser. So what happens here is an HTML file comes down to your browser. This is the end user using the application. Inside the HTML, it's using a client library, so MCell.js. This library allows you to go to Azure Active Directory, get tokens. Once you have that tokens, it's actually the browser making the request to Microsoft Graph and pulling back data, rendering it within the application. You may have heard of Angular, single-page applications. It doesn't have to be a single-page application. It could be multiple pages. But the point here is that it's actually the browser requesting and rendering this data. So what's the advantage of that? Well, I really like this model. It's got some really cool advantages. One is that you could write this application and have it hosted on a CDN. Essentially very performant, close to the edge of the network, such that every request is not going to your backend, getting rendered, and then returned to the client. It's this static page with your application could be served quite quickly to your end user and could behave quite performantly. So imagine like you're building a mail experience and you don't want the page to reload every time you're navigating through your mail. All right, so let's dive into this demo. Sorry, just give me a minute here. OK, Here we are back at the portal. And I said we were going to save this quick start experience. So here it is. I'm really excited to show this to you. So here we've got all the different single-page applications, web applications, mobile and desktop applications. We're still within the context of our Ignite test app, and we go into JavaScript. So we pulled the documentation directly into the portal experience, so you're not, 2 pages, here's 1 page, here's the other page, and flip back and forth. No, we just bring it all together, and we do some extra nifty stuff here. The first thing, configure your application in Azure Portal. So it says, hey, in order for this sample to work, we're going to use the implicit grant flow. We're also going to set up a redirect URI. Well, we know exactly where that is. We brought it all together in one place in authentication, but I don't even need to switch into that tab. Watch this. I'm just going to say, make these changes for me. And it's going to preview these changes that I'm going to make. So it's saying, hey, there is a redirect URI that I'm going to go add. There are some values that I need to go modify in terms of making the implicit grant flow work. And I'm just going to say, make those updates. There it is. Your application has been configured to work. Step 2, I'm going to go download, save this guy on my desktop. Let me unzip this. OK, here we go. Step 3, configure your JavaScript app. So edit your indexed HTML and replace your application config. OK, let's go find it. All right, so here's my index HTML. OK, I found my client config that I want to modify. So I'm just going to go find my client ID, and I can find that in the overview, right? Well, I don't even have to do that. Because we know that you're in the context of this Ignite test app while you're going through this quick start, we can pull the information that you need into the quick start. So this is your application ID. All I need to do is click copy, and I'm ready to paste in my application. All right, we're going to save this off. And lastly, we're doing the idiomatic node thing, npm install node server. All right, here we are. Sign-in experience working. That was easy. Let's try it out. I'm going to sign in as John Doe. And you can see John Doe is an administrator. So there's consent, of course, that we can ask for the end user to say, hey, we'd like to access and read your profile. So any end user would see this. But since I'm an administrator, we just brought this experience in and said, hey, if you want to consent on behalf of your whole organization so they don't see this screen, you can make sure that they access these resources without ever being prompted. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to hit accept. All right, we've not only signed in, we've also called the Microsoft Graph. Super simple. How do they expect me to fill a 75-minute slot when it's this easy? I'm going to show you some of this code and how it works. All right, so you're already familiar with these things that we configured, the client ID, the scope permission that we're asking for, as well as the endpoint. We're just hitting the me endpoint to get some profile information. Let me show you the MSAL code. Now, the first thing is that we have a choice to make. We can either do login pop-up, or we can do login redirect. What's the difference? So imagine that your application has something interesting to show the user even before they're signed in. Some teaser or some functionality that they can do anonymously. Well, rather than interrupt their experience and send them off to a completely different page and then bring them back and potentially lose some state by doing that, we can instead just do login pop-up. And then we're going to call acquire token and call Microsoft Graph. So let me show you what that experience looks like. So here I've got MSAL, and I'm calling acquire token silent. And if that fails, I'm going to call acquire token pop-up on some conditions. So this is a really common pattern that you'll see throughout our samples of trying to get a token silently. And if that fails, then we do an interactive pop-up in order to try and get that token. So why don't we just collapse these into one API and try silently and then try interactively? Well, the reason we didn't just collapse these into one is that we want you to be able to control the user experience within your application. Imagine there's a whole bunch of files that you're listing, and I like to show properties, but it's not necessary. And if you wanted to get at the properties of those files, you're going to opportunistically try and call into the API and see whether you have access to get a silent token. And if you have it, great. I'll show some additional properties. But if I don't have it, I don't want it constantly popping up another login screen in front of my end user. So we give you this flexibility and choice to decide, well, when is it appropriate? Do you want to interrupt the user right now and get that token that you need, or do you want to wait? And let me explain a little bit more on some of these conditions. So the first is consent required. What are the situations in which you'd see a consent required? So imagine that I asked for a new scope. I remember the V2 endpoint, there's human readable scope, so I can ask for user.read. Now I might ask for groups.read. And when I do that, an end user may have to consent to that scope if they haven't done so already. Next up is interaction required. So imagine that I've got a conditional access policy put in place by my IT administrator, and it basically says this. When I'm on CorporNet, sign in, just using my username and password. But when I'm off corporate network, I want to enforce an MFA. So you have your laptop on the network, you're using the app, you close it down, you take it home, you open the app again. You get SSO because you're signed in, but there's this policy that needs interaction because when we pop up that interaction dialog, that's the opportunity for where we can ask for the MFA credentials. So that's another situation in which you wouldn't be able to silently get a token. And then the last where you wouldn't be able to silently get a token is if you've changed your password. This is another login's required because you've been invalidated. So if any of those conditions happens, we call acquire token pop-up, and now we go through the pop-up experience. All right, I'm going to keep adding on to the sample. We're going to do some more fun things with this. So I want to demonstrate the fact that we have access to the power of Microsoft Graph here. It's really easy, once you've got it all set up to call one API, to call the next API, and the next API, and the next API. It's the same pattern over and over again, It's just different scopes and different endpoints that you're hitting. So let's look up here. I've got, in my configuration here, a particular scope and a particular endpoint. So why don't I just ask for a new scope? So I'm going to ask for group.read.all. And I'm going to hit, instead of the me endpoint, I'm going to hit the groups endpoint. And I'm going to save this. Now, I want to call out something here. I didn't actually have to go and configure my application in order to get access to another resource. We just asked for the scope we wanted, groups.read.all at runtime. Now, we call this dynamic scopes. And it allows you to do some really cool things. So building on top of dynamic scopes is another concept called incremental. So imagine that you're using your phone, and you download an app, and it says, hey, I want access to the world. I want camera. I want everything. And you go, OK, this just makes me really uneasy. Why do you need to ask for all this stuff? Now, imagine the second scenario where you download an app, and it says, hey, I just need minimal permissions. OK, I'm willing to do that. I install it. And then when I click, hey, I want to cache a check, oh, you need access to the camera in order to cache the check? OK, in context, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I'm not uneasy about that. You asked for permission just in time when it made sense to me why you were asking for that permission. And then I'm willing to say yes. So that's what incremental consent is all about. So I save this off. And we're going to go back. And we're going to refresh the page. Now, am I going to get single sign-on? So we're going and trying to get a token. And it popped up on the other screen. So what happened? It's trying to get a token, but the permissions and the consent has changed. Now I need to prompt the user to consent to these new changes. So I'm actually signed in with multiple accounts at the moment. But if I select the account that I want to use here, it says, hey, there's some permissions required. Oh, and again, you're the administrator, so you could consent on behalf of the entire organization. So I'm going to go ahead and do that again. I'm going to click accept. And that's it. Now we're calling a new API and graph. All we had to do was change the scopes, the permissions, and the endpoint that we're hitting. So this 8 trillion objects that exist in Microsoft Graph is at your fingertips. It's that easy. I'm going to keep playing with the sample. I'm going to do another thing. I'm going to bring up a really old API that I had from a long time ago. And I'm going to show you what it does. Now this project is, I had to dust off an old sample. So this is one of our really old 8L samples, which has got a client and a server. And essentially what this does is the server just keeps track of a to-do list of items, and the client securely calls the server, allows you to add things to the to-do list, read from the to-do list. But because this was built some time ago, this service only accepts tokens that are in the V1 format. So let me just show you what this does. I'm going to hit F5. So there's the service. There's the client. just going to add something to the service. OK, great. We've added something. I don't need these anymore. I don't need this anymore. Sorry, just give me 1 minute. And now I need to bring up my JavaScript sample that we're going to modify. And what are we going to do? All right, so how do we modify this guy? Now, I'm calling an API which only accepts V1 tokens, right? Where do I get V1 tokens? Well, V1 endpoint. V1 endpoint only accepts applications that are registered on portal.azure.com, which are V1 applications. And that means I need to use 8LJS. So I'm going to pull in 8LJS into this application and have both 8LJS and MLJS is the Microsoft graph. 8L.js is going to call my old API with a V1 app registration, which has been given permission to this other application. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, right? I don't think I have time for that in this demo. So let me show you how we're going to use an MCell application to call a V1 API. First off, we don't need a new app registration. We're going to use our existing app registration. An app is an app. 2, it's going to be as simple as the other situations. We're just going to modify the scopes that you're asking for and the endpoint that you want to call. So first up, we got to go modify our existing app registration. So we're going to add a permission. And I'm going to go find my API. I'm going to add the permissions. And the permissions have changed. Again, we've made it easy such that you don't have this embarrassing situation where your own app doesn't have access to your own API. So I'm just going to push out consent. And let's bring up the JavaScript sample. So I said it's going to be as easy as updating the scopes and the endpoint. So here, how do you call a V1 API? Well, the scope, remember scopes in V2 are human readable, user.read, all, whatever it may be. In V1, it was based on an app URI. So here's the app URI, and then I've appended this thing called .default. .default just means, the permissions and scope allowed for my application, meaning just give me everything that I used to get if I were calling from 8L. And then the endpoint. So here's my service running on Azure. Oh, I'm going to do one other thing just so nobody gets confused here, which is they're not calling the Microsoft graph anymore. We're calling my to-do API. So we're going to save this off. Cross your fingers. Hit F5. There we go. That easy, calling V1 APIs from an MCell app. OK, I got another demo for you. I'm going to squeeze it in. How many of you have standardized on one language throughout your own company, meaning only Python, only C#? No, none of you. It doesn't make sense. We know that we have environments where people use the languages of their choice to get things done when it's the most productive language to do the job at hand. So we want to make that easy. ADEL wrote to a binary format. So it's serialized using like a platform idiomatic way of serialization. This binary format is not very portable, meaning if you want to read it from Python, you want to read it from Xamarin, whatever it may be, it's just not very portable. So we came up with a new format. This new unified cache is a JSON format. And we updated ADEL to be able to read from this format. And we updated MCEL to be able to read from both formats. So why did we do that? We wanted to make sure that there was no gotchas, that you didn't end up in a situation where an ADEL app couldn't access some version of the cache, or an MCEL app couldn't version of some of the cache. We wanted all of these apps to be able to get single sign-on with each other. All right, so let me demo this for you. All right, here's a sample that has an ADEL cache using ADEL v3, ADEL v4, and MCEL. So first up, we're going to set our startup project as ADEL. We're going to make sure that there's no cache currently. So I'm going to delete any cache that exists. We're going to run this guy. Bring it to the right screen. So it's just a command line app. It's no frills. It says, hey, I cannot SSO at the moment. I need you to sign in. Now, it's using an embedded browser here. So I sign in. And it says, I got a token, but without the cache. I didn't get any help from the cache. OK, great. Let's run it again. And it says, hey, I logged in, and I silently got tokens from the cache. So let them one more time. And here we go. Here's the binary format I was talking about earlier that ADEL v3 understands. Well, now we're going to go to ADEL v4, which so I'm done with this. We're going to set this as a startup project. I'm going to run this guy. All right. All right, so now if I look at the file system, I'm going to see that I have a no unified cache. So this is the portable cache format that I was talking about. So I'm going to open this up. And if I can remember the hotkey. Here we go. Here's the access tokens, refresh tokens, ID tokens, accounts in a portable format. And then if I go set this guy, and I run the MCell project, and it says, yeah, I just got it from the cache. So it was already there. All right. I'm going to show you just really quickly how this works. So here you see this file-based token cache. This is actually an extensible object that you can inherit from and override. So I'm going to jump into this definition. And there's essentially a couple callbacks here. One is you get triggered right before ADEL needs to access the cache. And so you could essentially read it from persistence. This could be from a distributed system. It could be from SQL. And then you get a synchronous callback right after the cache has been accessed. So you can check if the state has changed. And if it has, you can say, OK, it's time to persist it. I'm going to push it back to SQL. This allows for some really interesting scenarios in terms of if you're running in a server environment and you want this cache to be pushed everywhere. All right. I would like to invite up Doron from Project Central. He's a customer of ours, doing some interesting stuff with our technology.
Thank you, Saeed.
Thanks.
Pleased to be here.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask you, tell me a little bit about Project Central.
So Project Central is designed to be a project management app to give a really good, simple, engaging experience to people and teams for managing projects, get them more productive, quicker, and get great visibility across all the projects within the team or department or organization. That's the marketing line. So for the purposes of this session, the key points will be that it's a multi-tenant SaaS solution hosted on Azure. And we have been using MCell for the last 12 months. And I've went live with MCell 5-6 months ago. So
what made you choose?
The good news is it all worked. No problems.
What made you choose MCell and the V2 endpoint?
The main carrot with choosing MCell was we potentially thought we might have to hook in Azure B2C at one point. The other one was the incremental consent and expanding the product out over time and getting a better user experience in there.
Yeah, that's great.
You did a good demo on it there as well, so you did.
So what was your experience so far?
The experience has been good. We've had a couple of issues. As soon as ASP.NET Core 2 released, we went with that. And the main issue was that we had no sample code or whatever. There was no sample apps out on the web that showed the MSAT integration. I would have loved to have your quick start stuff. You should have named your sample app the Alleluia app. That would have saved me a lot of gray hair. But that definitely is really cool, so it is. The only other issue we had, which is worth noting as well when developing web server code, the token cache access is synchronous, and you need to help improve it a bit and make it asynchronous.
Yeah, I remember your feature request on GitHub, yeah?
Thank you, yeah.
So what do you do for testing?
For testing, that's a good question, because we have probably 1,500 integration tests that we run every night against our web APIs, and we don't really want MSAT in that because it's going to be going to the Azure AD to do the authentication hops. So we used one of the new features of ASP.NET Core 2, where you can plug in your own custom-built authentication handler. So, and it's very simple. You pass the authorization header. It checks against a JSON file. If it's a member of the JSON file, populate the claims, and then all your code that accesses HTTP context.user works away fine. If not, you send back the authorization piece. It's very, very simple, very, very pluggable. And within the normal web server code, we use msal.net in the configuration.
That's great.
Yeah.
Any advice for folks out watching this?
Yeah, definitely start using the quick start, but also reference the sample code in docs, because it's great having quick start code, but you need to understand the touch points of MSAL, so the code redemption, the acquire token silent, how to fall back on that, the token cache access as well.
Yeah.
It's really important to understand those. The other point would be demos.microsoft.com. It's a great resource for creating demo tenants that you can go in. Make sure you use those demo tenants for hitting your application, for testing your authentication and the code redemption and all that kind of stuff. And finally, the what's called the office hours, the Azure AD office hours for developers. That's a great resource as well. Constant new stuff coming out, telling features like G guys are doing. And there is a load of them on YouTube already from the last few months. So definitely worth checking out those.
Yeah, so if you're interested in any of those resources you mentioned, just come find me after the session. I can connect you. I thank you so much for coming up here. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you very much.
And it's not just customers that we have trying this out and giving us feedback and getting us to GA. We use the same technology within Microsoft. There's no special sauce. So we have like a list of 10 to 15 partners that we're engaged with already in terms of requirements and integration testing. Teams provided us some great feedback about that SSO experience. So when migrating from ADL to MSAL and being able to maintain the sign-in state of users, that was feedback directly from these guys. So we're wrapping up here. The Microsoft Identity Platform. I talked about reaching your target audience in terms of B2B, B2C, all the organization and individuals that you need to be able to reach. We talked about security and trust in terms of the advanced identity protection and the machine learning that we have at play, as well as the consent model. We talked about being ready for your business in terms of all the data, the 8 trillion objects that exist in a Microsoft Graph already that you could take advantage of. The easy integration into your existing services. We talked about fast and simple, and I really hope I convinced you that we're working hard to make this a better experience. Quick starts, no choices, complex choices about, if I'm calling a V1 API, I have to use a completely different stack. And lastly, being able to update at your own pace. This is just so important from so many customers have given me feedback of, we've got existing investments. I don't want to rip and replace everything all at once. I just want to adopt where I see value. And over time, I'll figure out how to update these other services or apps. We have a lot of sessions here to learn more about the identity platform and the Microsoft Graph. We've got Kyle here is going to give a sample about architecting your app's access and security. He's going to cover a number of really interesting topics like the architectural decisions between multi-tenant apps and single-tenant apps, the different flows that you might use, a bunch more about permissions and consent. I'm giving a theater tomorrow talking, focusing on SSO and the best practices around SSO. So be sure to take a look, check us out. We've got a booth that you can visit us at. We've got in the immersion zone a lab you can try out, and then we've got some handy links here in terms of where you can read more, in terms of documentation. You've got a chance to win a t-shirt here. You can ask questions. If you need help, we have places on Stack Overflow. And if you need support, we have a link to how to file CSS tickets. And then we've got a survey, aka .msal survey. So I'm just going to leave this up for 1 second in case anybody wants to take a picture or read about it. And then last, please, please, please give us feedback on the session. If you want to see me again, let me know. You can vote me off the island. Thank you. If there's any questions, feel free to hop up to the mic. We've got 4 minutes left if there's questions.
It's really cool what you've done to kind of bring that experience together. It's clear you've been listening to feedback. Oh, is it hot now? So looking at that, it's obviously, I think it's going to do a lot to help with developers adopting, Azure AD. One of the things, though, that strikes me about that being an identity architect at a large firm is I wonder what that means under the covers, especially in terms of relationships between applications and directory tenants. So what you just did by just creating an application and then picking a radio box that says, I want to do social too, what does it really mean under the covers? Did that create a service principal in a B2C directory as well as creating it in a normal Azure AD tenant? Or
Principal work in B2C is that when you create an app registration and you need to be able to access data and get access to users in the directory, when you create an app in the Azure AD B2C blade, it's actually creating the service principal for you. And that's to prevent embarrassing situations where you would get a consent screen saying, hey, this user has signed into B2C and now wants access to things that are in the B2C tenant. I mean, you're writing an application to be able to reach your customers. You really don't want the customers to see, when you're signing into Real Madrid, seeing a consent screen saying, Real Madrid would like access to your data in Real Madrid. It doesn't make sense to do that, right? So there is still some unique situations in terms of B2C, but we are bringing together that same app registration experience, meaning they're not going to build a separate one. We're going to use the same app registration experience. There'll just be some additional steps that we do for B2C apps that make the developer experience easy for when you're writing one. I'm happy to kind of really go deep in on the whiteboard if you want to come grab me at the session too.
Okay. I mean, I guess where I'm coming from is I'm trying to figure out when you go in and just register that app, I'm assuming that was done in the context of whatever directory you happen to be in.
Yeah, it's in the context of the directory you're in.
So when you click social, did that just like spin up a B2C instance because you click the social option? Or?
No, you actually still need to register an app within the B2C tenant.
Okay. So there was more to go there. Okay, so the bottom line is B2C is still a product in and of itself with its features.
It's a product in and of itself, but we've tried to make the development experience exactly the same, meaning
like that.
It's exactly the same in MSAL, exactly the same in terms of the app registration experience. The end-to-end should be exactly the same. The only really difference is that B2C has this concept of policies. Yeah. So you can specify, hey, I want the specific sign-in, sign-on experience, whereas in Azure AD, we don't have that same, identity experience framework policy engine.
Right, understood. Okay, so like just to take it the next step, thanks. So imagine you wanted your app to be like multi-tenant essentially. Is the vision, I don't know where you're at now, but is the vision that you would still have to go to a separate AD tenant to register that new service principal, or is the vision, well, I guess you kind of have to if it's someone else's tenant.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways that happens. One is that we brought that experience right into the consent dialog when an administrator is signing in and there's not already a service principal that allows this application. And so you can say, hey, yes, I actually want all of these permissions granted to all of these users. The other is that if your app is in the Azure Active Directory gallery, there's a definition file that says, hey, these are the things that I need in terms of permissions. So when an IT administrator is adding that application into his organization, that's a multi-tenant app, they would go to add a gallery, they'll click a button saying, hey, add this thing. It'll say, hey, in order to add this app, it needs these permissions. Do you want to grant them to all users or specific groups? They'll say, sure, yep, go ahead. And all of that magic will happen under the hood. So you can build these great onboarding experiences for IT. If you're like an ISV writing line of business apps that are deployed in multiple organizations. I think also Kyle might cover a little bit in that in his topic.
All right, cool, thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.